Thanks very much for this opportunity. I've learned much about philosophy from many people in this Microsoft Teams room, that's for sure. So it's great to be with you all. Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things. There's some parts of the article, some topics that I have kind of views about or opinions on. Not others. In some cases, I'm really just surveying the literature, and I'm kind of agnostic about the various views. In other cases, I do have views. So just a quick sort of summary or recap then. Um, Let's take a fairly traditional or standard definition of God as a personal being who is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good, and who's the creator and sustainer of all that contingently exists. It's not the only definition of God, of course, but it's a pretty prominent one. This being is generally thought to have a will, and this will is generally thought to be free. Why? Well, traditional reasons are that you've got to have free will in order to be morally responsible, or maybe free will is an excellence that you think a divine being ought to have, right? So it's pretty familiar view that God is free. But after that, the disagreement starts because, as we all know, there's lots of accounts of freedom, both divine and otherwise. So quickly, I run through, four main accounts of freedom. Sometimes these are thought to be necessary conditions for freedom, or sufficient, or maybe both, right? There's controversy about all that. The first one is the familiar view that you must have alternative possibilities at the time of action, or it must be within your power to do otherwise than you do. The second one is absence from external compulsion or external constraints. The third one is being responsive to reasons. The fourth one is agent causation or ultimate sourcehood. So, and there's lots of debates in the human and in the divine case about these various accounts of freedom. So I try to set the stage by distinguishing these. And then the rest of the article is applying, is really running through a number of debates in philosophy of religion with an eye to how they turn on these different accounts of freedom. So the first one, which I was just talking about, is the one that I found very difficult to write. There's this big literature about whether there's a problem between in claiming that God is both omnipotent and morally perfect, right? That maybe there's a tension there if they're both essential attributes, right? A perfectly powerful being ought to be able to sin and so forth, but maybe a morally perfect being can't do that. So there's there's this alleged tension, and there's a whole bunch of responses to it. I won't go into the details now. Then the next three applications really have to do with debates about God's choice of a world, right? So suppose Leibniz was right and there's exactly one best of all possible worlds. It's a familiar enough thought that God would have to pick it and that God wouldn't be free in picking it, right? But maybe that view is wrong. Maybe there are lots and lots of ties at the top. Maybe there are equally good worlds, or duplicate worlds, or trivially different ones, or incommensurable or incomparable ones, right? Okay, well then you've got sort of a twofold problem. Is God going to pick one of the best ones or one of the suboptimal ones? Does God have a kind of choice there? And then there's the secondary problem of among that array of tied or equally good or whatever worlds, how's God going to pick, or which one is God going to pick? Are there some issues there? Third topic in this area is suppose we change the picture a little bit. Suppose now that there's a hierarchy of increasingly better worlds with no upper bound, no best worlds. Pretty familiar view in philosophy of religion. Well, then what's God going to do? And this, of course, is what Rowe had a lot to say about in the previous version of this encyclopedia article, right? Rowe thought that on that view, on that ontological backdrop, God could not exist because it would be impossible for God to be essentially unsurpassable. So those are those three models of divine choice of a world. Then near the end, I talk a little bit about this related issue about whether God is worthy of thanks or praise or worship. It's often thought that God can only be worthy of these things if God is free. So maybe freedom is a necessary condition for those, but that's controversial as well. And then in the last section, I try to tie things together by pulling together some threads about how concepts of divine freedom or models of divine freedom bear on different arguments, mostly against theism, but one or two arguments for theism as well. So that's the idea. Distinguish some models of divine freedom and kind of see how they unfold through a bunch of debates in philosophy of religion, to which many folks in the room have contributed. I should especially thank Tim Mawson, by the way, because Tim was very kind to give me some excellent comments on an earlier draft of this article. So any mistakes that remain are his fault because he didn't catch them.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you for that fantastic introduction. We really appreciate not only your brief summary of the article, but the article itself. And so, with that, I'll turn to questions that I know invariably most people have. And first, because he just raised his hand, I'm going to go to John Martin Fisher. So, John, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Klaas. I had not read your piece prior to being invited to come to this, and so the invitation was good motivation, and I really appreciate it. Excellent piece, really helpful and clear and comprehensive. So thank you. I have
Thank
just
you.
an idea or a couple of observations for people's consideration. I haven't thought about it long enough to be confident or less unconfident than I usually am. But in any case, one thing I notice is when you talk about reasons responsiveness, you talk essentially about the agent's reasons responsiveness. But the way I like to think of it, an agent, human agent, acts freely if and only if she acts from a reasons responsive mechanism. So, where a mechanism is not a thing, but a way. So, there's a certain way in which one acts uh, when one acts freely. So, that does not require freedom to do otherwise. It doesn't require determinism and so forth. What I wanted to do is try out the idea that God acts freely insofar as God acts from a reasons responsive mechanism, from his own reasons responsive mechanism. And the problem, if you think of God being reasons responsive, it seems like that requires that God choose a world or act on a bad reason, so that there's some world. So if a human agent acts from a reasons responsive mechanism, there's some world in which that agent does wrong, actually responds to a bad reason. But with God, that's not possible. So what I'm trying to suggest is you can extract a mechanism analytically. Um, and you can ask yourself whether, so what my view requires is that God acts in a certain way, that we can understand this mind of God as functioning in a certain way. And all bets are off, as far as I'm concerned, if you can't. Nelson Pike said we should understand God's beliefs as much as possible like human beliefs. And of course, we have physical minds. God doesn't, so maybe all bets are off. But I like to think we could say God's mind works in a certain way. Now we can extract that and say, in an almost absolute being, or in an abstract being who's not perfect, who doesn't have all the other divine attributes, if the agent acts in that way, in the same way, uh, could it act in a reasons responsive way? And if so, now in the imperfect, almost God, there is a possible world in which that being does wrong. But if you now say God can act in that way without its being the case that the statement God acts in a bad way is true, then I think that's the way I would tend to think of God's freedom. So, I mean, this is kind of similar. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for giving this mini lecture. My wife yells at me because she says I do it. But let me just, I wrote these papers published in the Philosophical Review in the 80s, I think. So when dinosaurs were roaming around in the 1980s, and one of them was called hard type soft facts. And what I thought was, let's say you adopt the entailment criterion of soft fact. Um, Now, what I tried to do is say there's a parallel distinction, uh, not with regard to facts, but properties. And now a soft property would be a property such that if any individual had it, it would entail the relevant thing in the future. But you can abstract or extract that property and you can imagine what it would entail if someone else other than God had it. So that's just an analogy. So I'm going to, bottom line, one observation. You don't talk about, you don't relativize reason's responsiveness to mechanisms. And that's just my little hobby horse, which is fine. Other people think you should do it in terms of agent. But if you switch to mechanisms and you're allowed to say God's mind works in a similar, in a certain way, and that way might be reasons responsive. Yeah, because you're going to extract it analytically and imagine some other abstract being acting on that mechanism. Now you re-import it to God, and now you say, okay, that's the way I'm thinking of it. I don't know if that made any sense.
Well, thank you, and I really appreciate getting your feedback on this because you know these issues much, much more than I do. Let me try to understand. So, is the thought that reason's responsive model requires a mechanism, and this mechanism only makes sense for a suboptimal or surpassable beings? Is that the gist of the first point?
No, so it's what I'm saying is it makes sense even for God, but you have to think of quote, reason's responsive mechanism as uh, a description that picks out a certain way, okay, a certain way. And God can act in that way, okay. And the way, and reason's responsive mechanism, but he can't act on a reason's responsive mechanism. He can act in a certain way, which we pick out by calling it reasons responsive. And we can see that it is because that same way instantiated in a non-perfect being, has the property that that being is reasons responsive. I don't know if this helps. And it's almost like I'm distinguishing secondary and primary qualities, or a description from the real essence. And the description of God's mechanism, of that mechanism might be reasons responsive, but it picks out actually a certain way, a way the mind functions. And if God's mind functions in a certain way, you could say it functions in the same way as this other abstract object. Anyway, I shouldn't take any more time.
No, thanks. Okay, so I think I've understood it. So this is a defense of the claim that God's freedom could be understood as being reasons responsive by importing an account of how a different being might act or might respond to reasons rather. Okay.
Right. God acts freely insofar as he acts from a certain kind of mechanism. His mind acts in a certain way, and that way is the same way that another being could act, where the other being would be reasons responsive.
Yeah, I think I get it. I don't have much to say off the cuff about this proposal, other than it certainly looks like it's worth adding in a subsequent revision or discussing. Do others have thoughts or views about this defense of divine freedom from John?
Maybe we'll circle back to it, but I just have to say it was an honor to hear that interchange between you two, especially coming from the person who created the reasons responsive view. What an honor. All right. With that said, I want to transition to the next person in the queue. We'll go to Steve for his question.
So Klaus, I really enjoy your work, and the article was great. I'm curious as to why someone would think that God's not responsible because he's compelled. So, and I know you've kind of seen this argument, but the argument is, look, a kleptomaniac is not responsible because somehow he suffers from internal compulsion. Someone who is kleptophobic, so he can't steal, he has similar motivation, but it's just directed in the opposite way. He's not responsible because of compulsion. Someone who's kleptocorrect, who steals when and only when it's permissible, isn't responsible because he's really indistinguishable from the other two. He just has a different set of desires. And God is, in some sense, kleptocorrect, right? In that his psychology dictates that he'll steal when and only when it's permissible. And the idea is that all four cases, they lack control and they don't make a choice with regard to their psychology. They neither control nor choose their psychology. And if they don't choose their psychology, they don't choose their motivation. They don't choose their motivation. They don't choose. They can't control their psychology. They can't control their motivation. If they can't control the motivation, they can't control their choice. If they can't control the choice, they can't control their action. So why isn't God compelled and hence not responsible?
Right. So you're talking about internal compulsion here, not external compulsion, I take it.
Yes.
Yeah, good. So the way this factors into the literature is the claim that God is compelled internally by God's nature. God's nature determines how God acts, and so if you're an indeterminist or an incompatibilist, rather, that's a problem for divine freedom, right? If you're a compatibilist, it's not a problem. It's worth saying that right off the bat, right? God's nature could compel God, and you could still be free if you're a compatibilist, right? So suppose you're an incompatibilist. And you think that God's nature compels God, then you've got prima facie a problem, right? I don't really have an axe to grind, so to speak, on this debate, but I can quickly remind you of some of the responses that are out there, right? So one response is to say, look, it's kind of a mistake to think that God's nature is somehow this one part of God that's determining another part of God, because God is simple. There are no parts or divisions in God. God and God's nature are identical. The doctrine of divine simplicity is super mysterious, right? But that you might try to invoke it in order to avoid this problem. Tom Talbot tries to distinguish between God's essence and God's nature, and says, well, it's really God's essence that's supposedly doing the work by to internally compel God, but in essence, hey, is an abstract object, and those aren't causally efficacious. Okay, that's one response. And then, as you know, I'm sure there's a lot of debate about theistic activism, right? So the thought is, yes, God's nature drives what God does, but God is the cause of or responsible for God's nature, right? That's a view associated with Thomas Morris, right, or Morris and Menzel, called theistic activism, and it too is super controversial, right? So those are three ways that people have tried to reply to this charge that God is internally compelled, and as I say, they're only relevant, I suppose, if you're an incompatibilist about divine freedom in the first place. So there's various ways to avoid that charge. But I don't have a worked out view about all the different versions of the doctrine of divine simplicity. I find theistic activism super strange as well. It seems to me like there might be a circularity problem there, right? But in any case, these positions are defended by people far smarter than me.
Well, I deny they're smarter than you, but I don't think any of these responses work. Compatibilists, I think, are subject to this argument, just like everyone else is. A compatibilist has to say that a kleptomaniac is not responsible. So I don't think just by being a compatibilist you escape this. The idea is that God is pure willing. Well, that doesn't help us at all, right? I mean, the question is, can he control his willing? If he can't, then he's no more responsible than the kleptomaniac is. So that's not going to help him, even if the theory made sense, which, as you pointed out, it's pretty mysterious. And the idea is that God causes or explains his own nature makes little sense, in that something has to explain God's nature. If it's not God's nature, well, then what else could explain it? If it's God's willing, the question is, what explains God's willing? So I want to suggest, and again, your article and your work is excellent, but I want to suggest to you that there's no solution here. I mean, God is compelled, he's not responsible. And by the way, that controls both significant responsibility, choosing between good and evil, and insignificant responsibility. That is, he's not responsible, period. And theism should take that into account. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, so if you're right, that would be a serious problem for models that try to show that it's coherent to say that God is free, right?
Awesome. Well, soon to be seen. Steve and I are working on a book on the topic, but yes. Okay. Next in the queue, we have Dan. So Dan, if you'd like to ask your question, go ahead.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for the article. I'm teaching a course next spring that I might use some portions of your article for.
Great.
But there is something that I wanted to ask you about, and that it seems it's sort of a microcosm of an issue that I think appears in a lot of philosophy of religion, which is something like this: so the authors that you've described seem to think, and maybe I'm getting this wrong, but this is the way it seemed to me when I read your article. It seemed to me that a lot of those authors think that if God isn't causally determined, then God isn't determined at all. But that's a peculiar thing to think, at least from the perspective of anyone who does philosophy of physics, because in that context, determinism is not typically cashed out in terms of causation. So, for example, the locus classicus on determinism in that subdiscipline is John Ehrman's book on determinism, where he describes determinism in terms of natural laws. Now, and not in terms of causes. Now, we wouldn't, of course, want to say that God is determined by that God would be determined by natural laws. I think what this shows is that determinism doesn't have to be hashed out in terms of causation. And if that's true in general, then I would have thought that whether God is determined or has libertarian free will or whatever doesn't have to be cashed out in terms of causation either. That it could be cashed out in terms of other determining relations, perhaps. Does that sound right to you, or do you think that's something wrong with that, or I don't know if you could interact with that question a little bit.
Yeah, I didn't catch all of what you said. It hiccuped a little bit, but I think I got the gist of it. So, right. So someone might say, human beings are determined by physical laws. Well, no one's going to say that about God because God's supposed to be responsible for the physical laws or something like that. So there's no problem there. So you might say, but God's determined in a different way. I'm not sure what it would mean to say not causally at all, but maybe what I was talking about with Steve is relevant here, right? Maybe the thought that God's nature determines how God acts. That's not, of course, of kind of physical causation. I'm not sure what to think about whether it's causation, about whether it's a non-causal determination. Others in the room probably know more about this than me, but that would at any rate be an example of how someone could think that that God's actions are determined without it being a kind of physical causal determinism. Yeah, I don't know if that gets at your question.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there was at least one point in the article where I don't remember who had this sort of view, but there was someone you described had the view that if God is in some way modally constrained, then that wouldn't count as determinism. That seems flatly wrong, right? Like if there's modal constraints on God, but those modal constraints aren't causal constraints,
I see.
it seems like we should still count that as a kind of determinism. And one way that could be modal constrained is if God is constrained by God.
Yeah, so God and modal constraints. There's obviously a lot here. I love this image from Brian Leftow about God's modal footprint, right? So modal space looks different on theism than it does on naturalism. Maybe you think there's no bad possible worlds at all on theism, but of course, bracketing theism, it sure seems like there's an awful lot of terrible possible worlds in modal space. So is that a constraint on God, or is it something about God's nature that's affecting modal space? I guess I'm inclined towards the latter. But yeah, other than that, I'm not sure what to say. I suppose, there are some other way. If modal space looks like one of the scenarios I described, where there's no best of all possible worlds, you can rank them all with no upper bound or whatever, then God has to, in some sense of has to, work within that framework. And if you're Roe, you think then there can't be a God. If you're most other people in philosophy of religion, you basically think, look, God can satisfy us in one way or another. So yeah, those are some ways in which your conception of modal space bears on your view of divine freedom. So I guess I don't know. I guess I accept the point. I guess there could be constraints on God that certainly aren't physical, that aren't causal. Nature is one of them. Modal space may be another. So I guess I'm friendly to what you're saying. Yeah.
All right, awesome. Thank you for the question, Dan. So now we're going to turn to Paul for his question.
Klaas, this was a great entry. Really, really nicely done.
Oh, thanks, Paul.
Which, I'm on the editorial board for the philosophy of religion stuff, but I wasn't your editor for this one, but it's turned out really great. I do have a quibble about what you say about Pike's article in the 5th paragraph of section 2.1. Do you have do you have that available?
I'm pulling it up.
Cool. I'm looking at it right now. So
Yeah, go ahead.
You say that, I mean, at the beginning, you point out that well, anyways, let me focus on right in the middle of that paragraph where you draw a conclusion that surprised me when I read it.
Okay.
So after you describe some parts of Pike's position, you say, thus he thinks essential omnipotence and essential moral perfection are compatible, and so this constitutes a fourth way to resolve the tension. But Pike doesn't think it's possible to be essentially morally perfect. He thinks to be morally perfect, you do need to have alternative possibilities. And so his, that's not really what he's arguing for. I think he thinks even if God doesn't have his attributes essentially, there's still a problem, a tension between, if not just there's no tension between omnipotence and always doing what's morally right. There's no tension there. But there's a tension between omnipotence and impeccability, right, as a divine attribute. So omnipotence means you can bring about things that would be wrong to bring about, and impeccability says that there's some sense in which you can't bring about things that would be wrong to bring about because you're above temptation. There's some sense in which you can't do it, and he's trying to, and that doesn't mean, and you don't cash out that, you don't have to cash out. Part of his point is you don't have to cash out that can't do wrong, or it can bring about things that would be wrong to bring about, in terms of it being impossible that you do that. I mean, because his view is that it may be that you can't, because of the strength of character that you have, you can't bring yourself to do it. And that doesn't mean you might not have that strength of character in every possible world. So that's not talking about any kind of essential attribute, right? But it's still a sense of can't that is compatible with saying that you can, because of omnipotence, right? You have the ability, you have the productive power necessary to do it, but you can't bring yourself to do it. And so the two are compatible, and that's essentially his solution. But it's not which, again, just like I can't, given my background, you can maybe tell I love cats. But I have the productive power necessary to kick my cat. Sure. I can sneak up on him, surprise him when he's sleeping. My legs work fine, so on and so forth. I definitely have the productive power necessary to cause my cat to suffer by kicking it. But I could never bring myself to do that, right? And so that's kind of the essence of his solution. So yeah, it was everything. I mean, you talk about that. You talk about the strength of character and versus the ability to do it. But then you draw that weird conclusion right in the center of the paragraph that thus he thinks essential omnipotence and essential moral perfection are compatible. He doesn't even think essential moral perfection itself is coherent. So he doesn't think the combination is coherent.
Okay, thanks. I'm obviously going to have to look carefully at Pike 1969 to refresh my memory. For me, it was the complete assurance, right? Which is what I quoted, right? The complete assurance that we have that God will not exercise this ability. So, I was tempted, maybe wrongly, given the source text, to read that modally, like we have it will not happen, right? Which is stronger than Paul Draper will not kick his cat. We have assurance from your character that you won't kick your cat, but of course there's a possible world in which you kick your cat. So we don't have a kind of modally complete assurance that you won't kick your cat, but I thought that Pike was sliding into that stronger talk there. If you're right on the interpretive point, and I'm certainly not going to die on this hill, I could I could get the Pike stuff tweaked, and I could say, look, here's another view, call it Pike Prime, and then say that it fails to do the job, right?
Also,
Um,
I think you can, Pike's okay on the complete assurance thing because, on my interpretation, because you can have, the point is that the strength of character of God in the actual world is such that you can be assured. I mean, there may very well be Drapers and other possible worlds that are perfectly capable of kicking their cat because they don't have the same love for cats, because that may not be an essential property of mine.
sure.
But it doesn't mean that my cat can't be completely assured in this life that I will never do that to him.
So on your reading of Pike, the complete assurance only applies in the actual world.
Which is, of course, who cares about other non-actual worlds?
Right, right, right. And Nathan, you look like you're jumping in.
Yeah, no. Steve and I have a similar point that's related to what Paul just said. Maybe we'll cycle back to it later. But I think this is a good opportunity to transition to the next question, which comes from Tim. So, Tim, if you want to ask your question, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you, Klaas, for the paper, and thank you for the discussion so far, everyone. I had a thought which just occurred to me. It may sort of sink like a lead balloon quickly, but in response to the sort of question that Stephen raised about how, well, if you're an incompatibilist about the sort of free will necessary for moral responsibility, and you think it's in God's nature always to do the best or morally sorry, I should be more cautious, but morally praiseworthy sort of action. Well, then you can't actually sort of paradoxically count him as morally praiseworthy because he couldn't have done otherwise than that. So you've got that sort of problem. So I've sort of somewhat ham-fistedly put it, but that was the issue. And I wondered if there might be a case in where you might say, well, maybe in a situation where it is in a being's nature to do an action of a certain type, but it's not in his nature to do a particular token of that type rather than anything else, he could have this alternative possibilities open to him over which action of that type he performed, and be praiseworthy under a description of him as the performer of the action in the token form that he did it. So if it's in my nature to give you, Nathan, as a result of your kindness in arranging this, a sports car as a gift, there's just no way I can do other than give you a sports car as a gift. But I could give you a Mercedes, or I could give you a Porsche. I could go either way on that one. And I actually end up giving you a Porsche, and you get a Porsche sort of driven up by some chauffeur to your house tomorrow with a little gift tag attached from me and so on. It seems you could thank me for giving you a Porsche. And that's what you would naturally do. You'd say, Tim, I want to thank you for the Porsche. And if I said, well, actually, you should know before you thank me too much that I had to give you a sports car. So don't thank me for giving you a car, because I just had to do that. And so, you can't really praise me or thank me for that, or, feel too cheerful towards me in some evaluative way because of that. You might say, oh, right, okay, that's something I didn't know about you. But anyway, I wasn't really thanking you for giving me a car. I was thanking you for giving me this Porsche, which you didn't have to do. You could have given me the Mercedes, which would have been an equally good car, admittedly. But anyway, you have actually given me a Porsche. I'm thanking you for a Porsche. And I say, oh, then your thanks are accepted and seem appropriate and fitting to what I've done. So, see you later. So I wondered if God might sort of be able to sort of wiggle around there, as it were, and say, you know what, you can praise me, Israelites, for leading you out, of captivity through that bit of the Red Sea rather than some other bit of the Red Sea. Why? Well, because I could have led you through another bit of the Red Sea. Sure, I was going to lead you out some way or other. So don't thank me for that. But that's not what you're thanking me for. You're thanking me for leading you out of captivity through the Red Sea. And praising me for. So I'm covered. Praise is appropriate. I couldn't do otherwise than, in my theological example, get you out of captivity some way or other. But there were a number of different ways that I could have got you out of captivity. I picked one, and you're praising me for the one that I picked. You're not praising me for having picked amongst the ones that I had to pick one of. Does that work, do you think? Anybody? I've warmed to it as I've developed it, but it's probably full of holes.
So this is a point particularly about thanks and praise, not about freedom.
is sorry. Sorry, it is a point that even if God doesn't have libertarian free choice between some options, it might not seem totally conceptually inappropriate to praise him for a token action that he has performed of a type which is such that he had to perform one of those things. He had no option but to perform some token of that type, but he actually performed this token of that type when he could have done another, and that seems to be the sort of thing we'd be praising him for anyway, because we'd always be giving a specific. I wouldn't just be, if I was Moses, I wouldn't just say thank you for performing some action which was such that the Israelites have ended up here, whereas previously they were over there. I'd be saying thank you for leading us through the Red Sea. Just as Nathan would be saying thank you for the Porsche, not simply thank you for a car. And if praise is appropriate for that, I praise you, Tim, for your generosity, as it might be. It seems it would be. A car's a pretty good gift, and getting the Israelites out of Egypt was a pretty praiseworthy kind of accomplishment. Okay, that he got him out through the Red Sea is what he's been praised for, but yeah.
Do you think, Tim, that would still work when the options are really, really similar? Like maybe there's a big difference between a Ferrari and a Porsche, but if you go and buy me a box of Cheerios at the grocery store because I really like Cheerios and you couldn't have done otherwise than to buy me Cheerios, do I really thank you for buying this box of Cheerios as opposed to the virtually indistinguishable one that you might have brought me instead?
Well, I think you might do, because I think it's very human, as it were. If I gave you a box of Cheerios and here it is, Klaas, I know it's your birthday or whatever it is. I've not actually got much money and I can't really afford sports cars. If I could, then but anyway, this is the box of Cheerios. You would thank me. Oh, thank you for this box of Cheerios. You wouldn't say thank you for a box of Cheerios, of which this happens to be the one I'm being given. It would be a very unnatural construction to say I thank you, Tim, for the action of picking out a box of Cheerios from a shelf load of boxes of Cheerios. You would say, I thank you for this box of Cheerios that you've given me. And it would be true of that box of Cheerios that I was giving you and for which you were thanking me, but I could have given you another box of Cheerios. So I didn't have to give you that box of Cheerios. So I do satisfy that condition. Yeah, so I think it would, even with something like that, where there's one box of Cheerios is pretty much, similar to the next one, suppose, it's on the shelf. Whereas a Porsche is, I presume, somewhat different, at least from a Mercedes. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess you probably knew why I was asking, right? As there are some people who think, look, if there's this massive tie at the top for possible worlds and there's all these duplicates or whatever, right? Some people are going to say, well, God's freedom is well, either non-existent or trivial or something like that. It's not a big deal to pick, right? So suppose you're sympathetic to that, you could still say, okay, maybe God's only making a trivial choice here, but nevertheless, it's one that's worthy of thanks or praise. I don't know if there's conceptual space to do that.
Yeah.
You could deny that it's trivial, of course, as well, I suppose.
Yeah, I was thinking that the choice is it might be sort of trivial in one way, but sort of on another. So if Nathan does wake up tomorrow and he finds a Porsche sports car on his doorstep, he's going to think this is a pretty non-trivial happening, and I'm pretty delighted about it. And he finds out it's come from me. He's going to write me thank you letters and all sorts of things, and that seems appropriate. There is a trivial difference in value terms on my thought experiment between that and him finding a Mercedes sports car on his doorstep. And in fact, in my thought experiment, of my nature, I had to give him a sports car. And so when I was deciding between Porsche or Mercedes, that was trivial. Yeah, but the outcome is pretty impressive. And just as it would be a bit odd to say God leading Moses and the Israelites out of captivity, that was pretty trivial, wasn't it? Well, in religious history, that's not a trivial happening, but it was trivial that he led them down the particular path that he did lead them, rather than 2 miles. I don't know whether the Red Sea runs north-south or whatever it is, but further south down the Red Sea. So yeah, aspects of triviality about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to hear what others think, but I don't see any deep difficulty in saying that it's sensible to thank your benefactor in the way you described. I'm totally on board with it.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you for the question, Tim. So now we'll go to Steve for the next question.
So really enjoying the conversation. So thank you guys. Let's assume that God has maximum amount of value. That is, whatever value there is, he maxes it out. And so we want to know why God creates a world at all, and if he does, which world he creates. And this plays on Tim's reason. One might think, I do think, that you're responsible only if you can act from a contrastive justificatory reason. But of course, God doesn't have a contrastive justificatory reason to create a world, let alone which world to create. So it seems he's not responsible. It can't be a brute preference, which you kind of destroy that idea in your various writings, that brute preference, one, it seems to contradict God's independence, and two, why use one mechanism of why have one brute preference rather than another? And is creating a world at all, let alone a particular world, doesn't seem to add to the total or average. We've already posited that he's maxed out. So why isn't the case that God's not responsible, in the sense of not praiseworthy, for either creating a world or for creating a particular world?
So the particular version of this is that God's infinite, value confers equally infinite value on every possible world. So not only are there no bad possible worlds in modal space, there's no imperfect worlds in modal space. On theism, every world is unsurpassably good because of what the goodness that God confers on it by his existence or nature or activity or whatever, right? That's the model. I'll quickly plug Mark Johnson's work on this, right? He's got this terrific paper called Why Would the One Not Remain Within Itself? A fairly recent paper where he addresses this exact question of why would God create anything in a situation like that, if in some sense it's just as good for God to create nothing at all. But I guess, Tim, this is really meant to be a challenge for the picture you're developing. So I want to give you an opportunity to respond to Steve.
Gosh, well, I suppose I am pretty sanguine about God doing things for brute preference, as it were, as I tend to prefer to put it whimsically. So if axiological space is such that God surveys the whole range of possible worlds, and there's a tie for top place, and one has sort of red billiard ball in one position, and the other one has a blue billiard ball in that position in that reality, and in value terms, then there's nothing to choose between them other than that they're both ties. Then I think, well, of course, it would be rational for God to pick at random between those two ones. He would, if someone said, "Well, why did you choose blue billiard ball world rather than red billiard ball world? Come on, give me a good contrastive thing. What was so much better?" He'd say, "There's nothing better about blue billiard ball world than there was about red billiard ball world." I can tell you why I chose to be random within blue billiard versus red billiard ball world, that between the set of those two worlds, which to pick, they were better than any of the others. But between those two, no, there's no contrastive reason to be given. I had a brute preference for blue, or just whimsically chose blue. That's the way the cookie crumbled, and I was, better to have a crumbly cookie than to have no cookie at all. So that's why there's a cookie. To switch my metaphor. So I think he that seems quite coherent to me, but not maybe to anyone else. I don't
know. Steve, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I mean, I like your approach. I think it has a problem with God's independence. I mean, if he has a preference for blue over red, and there's nothing better about it, then it seems he's subject to random forces. If he's subject to random forces, then it seems that his nature doesn't completely explain his psychology. It seems to deny him independence. And in terms of Klaus's point about Mark Johnson's article, which I appreciate, I mean, I guess I'm more skeptical of Johnson's approach than you are. I mean, he says, look, what's valuable here is that you display or manifest God's goodness. I have no idea why that would be valuable. That's an extrinsic value in anything. If it doesn't maximize the total or average, why would we care whether or not he displays or manifests his own value? So I guess I'm far more critical of that article than you are. But I guess in response to Tim, I just think, look, if God has a random preference, one, as Klaus points out elsewhere, if he uses a random number generator, he has there's an infinite regress. How do you choose which random number generator? But two, why doesn't that contradict God's independence? Why isn't the fact that if he has a random preference, then his being the greatest possible being does not explain his his existence or his other features. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah. I suppose I was thinking that it wouldn't be something other than himself that you need to go to explain why blue billiard ball world popped into existence rather than red billiard ball world. So when he does actually create blue billiard ball world and we ask him about it, he doesn't say of his choice to create blue billiard ball that this was caused in me. This choice was sort of necessitated by a preference which I formed as a result of some external factor operating on me. He'll say, well, I looked at the range of possible worlds, and it turned out that blue billiard ball world and red billiard ball world were choice worthy, and none of the others were. And it turned out that neither of them was more choice worthy than the other. And in knowledge of that fact, I hence had to choose one of them rather than none of them, because otherwise I'd fail to have an essential property. And given that I had to choose one of them and there was no reason to choose one rather than another, I had to develop, if you like, a preference for one rather than another. But my developing a preference isn't a psychological state I need to whip myself up into, as a result of which then I can act and generate a blue billiard ball world rather than that. But it's just another way of talking about the fact that I did, in fact, knowing the value situation I was in, elect to create blue billiard ball world rather than red billiard ball world. So I don't see this as somehow him being sort of, pushed along in one direction by something other than himself, rather than him seeing what situation he's in, realizing that he doesn't want to be like Boweden's ass, and so picking, just picking as you say in one paragraph there. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have used the word preference. I don't know.
Just a quick response. I mean, so you said, look, God can be random, and that's consistent with his being the greatest possible being, completely explaining his existence. But the problem is there can be multiple ways that his nature can explain existence. I mean, it seems to be that in allowing randomness to come in, you lack a clean, decisive connection between his nature and his existence. In addition, it's a little hard to see how a being subject to randomness can be truly independent.
Well,
I mean, imagine his omnibenevolence were like subject to randomness. Would you still say that he's independent?
Well, no. So that's a sort of essential attribute of his. But I suppose it's if a perfect being is in a situation where he has a choice between two options, each of which is choice worthy and no other options are, but neither of which is more choice worthy than another. Is he the sort of being who is able in that situation to get beyond a Boweden's ass kind of, paralysis and pick one? And it seems to me, well, a perfect being would be able to pick one. Now, if you say, oh, well, that's him picking it randomly, I say, yeah, that seems like a fair description. Between those two options, it's random which one he picks, meaning there's no explanation of why he picks one rather than another in terms of some external factor. So sure, there's randomness in that way. But the randomness that you seem to sort of think and worry about is one which I might be reluctant to include. So I think there's maybe good randomness and bad randomness, and it's good randomness if it's getting you out of a Boweden's ass situation, and it's bad randomness if it's you being affected in how omnibenevolent you manage to end up being by some factor outside your control that itself has no predictability about it or some such. Okay, so yeah, we need to be careful about randomness, but I'm hemming it in a particular location and saying, look, it's safe there, don't worry about it.
Okay, perfect. Klaas, so I have a question that I'd like to ask. I mean, there were quite a few, but I think I'm going to stick to the one that I think is a little bit more pressing. So we are talking about insignificant responsibility, and so this is the one where you don't have a genuine choice between good and evil. Here's the crux of the question. Why I think that insignificant responsibility is a great making feature. Okay, so God only possesses great making features. He doesn't have, moderate features or mid features, average features. He has great making features, but insignificant responsibility just doesn't seem to be one of these things. Take, for example, one compatibilist understanding of responsibility, which would be mesh theory. So imagine God has an infinite array of higher order desires, and we just added another one, right? Would that make his life go better in terms of increasing his hedons? Would it satisfy more of his desires? Would it be an objective list good? Well, intuitively, it doesn't seem as though it makes his life go better. And we could see this with the case of humans. Imagine we have Jones, and Jones only has, let's say, 50 higher order desires, and we just add another one on the top. Does it make his life go better in terms of increasing his hedons? Intuitively, I argue that the case is no. Alternatively, imagine we subtract a first order desire because it doesn't really do anything, because then the second order desire is just going to collapse into the first order one. Does that make his life go better? Intuitively, again, I argue that the answer is no. And so if insignificant responsibility is not a great making feature, then why think that God would possess it? So here's the argument. If insignificant responsibility is a great making feature, then it makes someone's life go better. It's not the case that it makes someone's life go better. Therefore, it's not the case that it's a great making feature. If it's not the case that it's a great making feature, then I doubt we have a reason to believe that God would possess it. Now, notice we've already knocked out significant responsibility for the reasons that Steve and I have adumbrated thus far, and we have very little reason to believe that God is insignificantly responsible because we don't think that it's a great making feature. So he's not significantly responsible. He's not insignificantly responsible. And so I'm wondering where is divine responsibility left after those 2 points? But yes, if you could answer that question, that would be great.
Great, thanks for that. And apologies again for having to dash out to deal with the window cleaners. They've now left. I won't be summoned any further on any further occasion today. Okay. I would worry off the cuff. I would worry that your necessary condition is too strong, or that it's not a necessary condition at all. Why would anyone think that in order for something to be a great making property, it must make God's life go better? I'm not sure what quite that would mean anyway. But what about just tying it to power? A being that doesn't have the power to choose between tied or incommensurable or whatever options seems like a less powerful being than a being that can do that. Insofar as power is a great making property, or you're a greater being if you have more power, all else equal, or whatever. That seems to do the trick, right? Without worries about God's life going better. Another suggestion, sort of in the spirit of what Tim was saying, is that you might think that God has brute preferences or wants to express God's personality or something like that, and the ability to express one's personality or act on one's brute preferences. It's better to have that than to not have that. So yeah, my first reaction is to say I wouldn't put a whole lot of weight on this business about making God's life go better. But I think I can see a couple of ways that you might still say that it's a great making property for God to have what you call insignificant freedom. And
Okay,
I think that's going to be the orthodox answer anyway.
right.
I actually do have worries about brute preferences and this business about expressing personality and so forth. But in any case,
All right. So I have a main question maybe here. I had 3 points that I wrote down, but I think that maybe the last one is the more interesting one because it's an internal critique and those are safer. Why doesn't this just take down the free will defense? I mean, why not think, for instance, that Alvin Plantinga is going to come forth and he's going to say quite articulately, because he's a fantastic theist, that look, significant responsibility, especially within humans, is a great making feature. It's really wonderful to have this choice between good and evil. We're not mere automata. God gave us that significant responsibility, and we should use it in such a way that, I don't know, in a God-honoring way, so to speak, right? We choose the good thing, we avoid the bad thing, all of those things. But now it seems, well, insignificant responsibility is actually a great making feature, and we could tell this really neat story where it expresses our creative flair and so on and so forth. And then I think to myself, whoa, 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 pump the brakes. That contradicts a lot of the reasoning that we see in the free will defense. So if we're going to subscribe to this, then all this stuff about soul making potentially as well, in the free will defense, that's just going to kind of go out the window. So the question is this, do you want to subscribe to insignificant responsibility being a great making feature, or do you want to keep the free will defense?
Yeah, I don't know that it's a sort of a binary either or. I mean, in sympathy with what you're saying, and I think I say this in the article, it seems to me that there's a bunch of philosophers of religion who want to attribute libertarian free will to God on the grounds that it's such a good thing in the free will defense, as exactly as you say, for people to have free will, robust alternate possibility, libertarian free will, right? That's so good, so then it should be good for God to have it, so you'd expect that, right? But then you get into all these problems, right? And I think that motivates a lot of philosophers to try to come up with other models of divine freedom. I mean, it's a cheap move, but someone could say in response, listen, what's good for created persons is not necessarily the same thing as what's good for divine persons or divine personal beings, right? Um, uh, I don't think you'll be terribly impressed by that maneuver, but that's a move one could make here. You could also double down, I suppose, and say, look, sure, it's a good thing for created persons to have libertarian free will, and it's also good for them to have what you call insignificant freedom. And insofar as that's good for created persons, it's also good for God to have that, and off you go on your merry way. So yeah, but I take the thrust of your question, right? I mean, the importance of the free will defense does drive a lot of. I mean, look, as I mentioned, I think in the article somewhere, most professional philosophers are neither theists nor libertarians. Most professional philosophers of religion are theists and libertarians, right? That's a very striking sociological observation. And one explanation of it is that libertarian free will is really important for the free will defense, and the free will defense is really important for securing theistic belief, and that explains why philosophers of religion, tend in that direction.
All right, perfect. I really appreciate your answer to the question. It's given me quite a bit to think about. In light of that, I think that we're going to move to the next question, which will come from Paul.
This one has to do with section 6 of, section 2.6, the thing about the appropriateness of thanking, praising, worshiping God.
Oh
And
yeah.
I want to ask the question of the group, because I kind of having conflicting intuitions about this. So in that section, you talk about the issue of whether it's appropriate to be grateful to God or to praise God if he doesn't have alternative possibilities. And I think it's right that it does make sense to still be grateful and to praise God even if he doesn't have alternative possibilities. So yeah, I agree with that point. But then there is still a leftover issue. If you want God to be perfect, and you don't want it just to be the case that he's praiseworthy, you might want it to be the case that he's as praiseworthy as possible. And then you have the issue of, well, suppose even if it makes sense to be grateful and to God and to praise him, if he doesn't have alternative possibilities, would he be even more praiseworthy or or worthy of thanks if he does have alternative possibilities? And so it's kind of like, I don't know, if God is looking at Jesus has been crucified and raised from the dead. And he's looking at God wants to start he wants to start a new religion called Christianity. He doesn't want to just have Judaism. When he looks at James, Jesus' brother in Jerusalem, God says that guy's, he's only got a sect of Judaism going, that thinks that the Messiah has come. That's not enough. So he needs someone to kind of shake things up and really get this new religion going. So say that the best, he's essentially perfectly rational, and the all things considered best approach is to appear to Paul on the road to Damascus and get him to be the leader of this this new religion. All right, so then Paul likes the new job a lot. So St. Paul says, St. Paul is grateful to God for doing this, and it's appropriate for him to thank him and praise him even for selecting him for this important role, even though God, had being essentially perfectly rational and the strongest reasons favoring choosing Paul. He had really no other choice. So yeah, so that makes sense. But then again, so then the question is, so what about though if Paul found out, no, actually there was another guy I could have chosen instead that would have done just as good as you, right? And I had a lot, I had different reasons for choosing him, and so I was tempted, very tempted to choose him, but I decided to choose you, Paul. So we had alternative possibilities. Does that make him? Does that mean Paul should have more gratitude because of those alternative possibilities? He's more worthy of Paul's gratitude because he had this other choice. Or he's more worthy of, yeah, so put it that way, he's more worthy of Paul's thanks. And I'm not sure, I have conflicting intuitions about this. I'm just curious what your guys' intuitions are about this. Whether Klaas's or anybody else.
Yeah, I know that Steve has a book on gratitude. So maybe if you want to say something.
No, I mean, I just, the question is, can you really worship in a morally relevant sense without gratitude? I mean, if gratitude presupposes responsibility, you might think it's an odd sense of worship that doesn't have the gratitude feature in it. And it's hard to see why we would value that sort of worship.
Without worship with gratitude, yeah, so, okay, but the question is not whether, again, I'm assuming here that it's appropriate to show gratitude even for someone who benefits you, even though they couldn't have done otherwise. My question is whether is the person more worthy of thanks if you add on the alternative possibilities? That's the question.
I think my intuitions break down when it comes to thinking about this kind of question about God. On the one hand, I've never understood what justifies worship. But if we're just talking about like praise, it seems to me that much of the reason that we have for praising other human beings is due to the social context in which we live with them. Whereas in the case of God, there is no social context in which we live with God, right? Like it's so. I don't know. Like if when we praise other human beings, part of what we're doing is we're trying to encourage other people to act as they act. It's not obvious to me that that's what people are doing when they praise God. It seems at least that kind of motivation wouldn't be there.
See, this is the problem with philosophers. You ask a yes/no question, and you never get a yes or a no.
Yeah, I guess I might come to a more definitive answer if I think about this longer. But it seems to be that the cases are at least qualitatively distinct, and so at the very least, we wouldn't have the same kinds of like all of the same kinds of motivations in the two cases. Maybe there's other kinds of motivations that the cases share.
Fair.
Just a quick, can I just make a quick comment about this? Confession, I was really getting up to the word count when I got to this section, so there's a lot more literature on thanks and praise and worship that I didn't cover. It might be, Paul, that you're right that the debate about thanks, praise, and worship is unduly affected by this notion of appropriateness. I think that's the essence of your point, that maybe appropriate sets too low of a bar, right? So your objection seems isomorphic to, Robert Adams says God could satisfy us, create a suboptimal world, and not do anything morally wrong. Rose says, okay, fine, if I grant that the God doesn't do something morally wrong, God could still have done better, right? So your point is sort of similar, right? Maybe even if it's appropriate to thank and praise and worship God in various circumstances, maybe you want your deity to be more than merely appropriately thankworthy or praiseworthy, but unsurpassably so or whatever. So I don't know, maybe others know if that move is made in the literature on thanks, praise, and worship, but it does seem structurally similar to the Roe versus Adams point that I mentioned. The too low of a bar objection, basically.
Yeah, this seems fair. In Craig's recent 2025 book, he says that God is deserving of worship because he's morally perfect. So it seems like you need to get the perfection, like you need to max it out potentially. But again, I think that this is definitely going to repay further study and a rewatch, so to speak. But yeah, that means
I certainly, sorry, but I know you're about to move on, but I certainly just want to say, oh, I have conflicting intuitions too, Paul. You asked, oh, I wonder what other people's intuitions are, and I'm quite conflicted. If I was Paul and oh, sorry, my dog. If I was Paul and God said, yeah, actually, you're the only guy who could have done the job. And oh well, thanks for giving it to me. Versus, well, frankly, there were 5 of you, and I in the end tossed a coin, and it turned out to be you. Whether that should make him more thankful or I don't know really. I think of it as applying for jobs. Thank God it's been decades since I've had to apply for a job. But if you apply for a job and you get told you've got the job, you're delighted and you thank them for it. And if they say, actually, you were the only person who applied, it does affect your feelings a bit. If they say, well, frankly, there was a really strong field, and we interviewed 5 and any of them would have been ideal. But in the end, we picked you. You feel differently again. But I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
all right, perfect. So the next question will go to John.
I've actually applied for a job where they had 3 finalists. The 2 others turned them down, and then they told me, we've decided to go in a totally different direction. Anyway, that was unfortunate. Well, there were so many things that came up that I wanted to talk about. This has been, in my view, a great discussion. And if we were in a small seminar in person, I would have been able to be rude and interrupt or interject, but I can't. So anyway, a couple of points. I have for a long time been really interested in and struck by the parallels and differences between literature on free will and determinism in the secular context and the theological context. Just really interesting because the consequence argument is, similar in structure to the theological determinism argument in terms of the fixity of past and so forth. Also struck by the fact that in philosophy of religion, people tend to be libertarians. In the secular context, no, that people who believe the past can be flexible, as it were, when you consider these issues, or the laws, like David Lewis, really smart philosophers. So it's interesting. And right, you might think it's related to the problem of evil, but I'm very attracted to an actual sequence model of acting freely where you don't require freedom to do other. And I don't think you need freedom to do otherwise to answer the problem of evil. And, for what it's worth, I wrote this up in a paper in a volume, a Polish journal that was in honor of William Hasker. So if anyone wants to see, no doubt there are a lot of problems with it. But let me finally say, in your piece, you do consider the view that acting freely doesn't require freedom to do otherwise. And you also think about the reasons responsiveness idea, and the way some of us think about it. The reasons responsiveness is a way of understanding freedom that doesn't involve alternative possibilities. But there are other ways, that's what struck me. One of the problems with reasons responsiveness is there's got to be this other possible world in which God does the wrong thing or whatever. But, there are other accounts, like Frankfurt's account in terms of identification, but that also has certain problems when you apply it to God. But there is this idea, Susan Wolf talked about it, acting from your deep self, or Hume talked about acting from your character. I think they're a little bit different. Those are actual sequence accounts of acting freely that don't get in the same problems that we've been discussing about different possible worlds in which God is doing something wrong. I was just wondering if you might consider that a little more. And some of the examples in the secular literature go, well, you can think of Martin Luther, which, here I stand, I could do no other. But not just that, but the woman, the mother who comes home and she sees the house is on fire and she knows her kids are in there. She just can't do anything else but run in to try and save the kids. Maybe your intuition is she doesn't act freely, or she's not responsible, or we can trace it back. But there's a sense in which I think it's pretty clear she acts freely, but she couldn't have done otherwise. And the idea that, well, she could have acted against her deepest concerns and moral beliefs, and that's what makes her responsible. It just doesn't get at the heart of things. Daniel Dennett says that way her freedom is based on the freedom to be crazy. Just doesn't seem to get at the heart of things. And I thought Tim's suggestion was very, very interesting and beautifully articulated and defended. My intuition, it's the same deal. Like, what if she could have gone in the front door or the back door? Is that what grounds her responsibility? So anyway, I guess bottom line, I still think it's plausible to think of human freedom and God's freedom in a similar way, in that they don't require freedom to do otherwise. And there are various different accounts of actual sequence freedom. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. That's terrific. I hope I didn't give the impression in the piece that I was wedded to some version of libertarian freedom. I was trying to, capture the debate. And I think it's also fair to say that in the literature there are some philosophers of religion who are quite wedded to the idea that both human beings and God have libertarian freedom. But I would say there are many more who think that God's freedom doesn't require the ability to do otherwise, precisely when you get into these tricky situations, right? So, make of that what you will. I think it's also, well, maybe I'll put it autobiographically. One reason I was very daunted to take this on is that, to really do justice to it, you have to know the secular, as you call it, free will literature. And I can't begin to fathom how anyone, except maybe John Martin Fischer, could do that. I think it's fair to say that I think it's perfectly obvious, actually, that the secular free will debate is much more technical, intricate, detailed, many more positions and so forth than you find in the philosophy of religion, divine freedom debate. So you might say so much the worse for what the philosophers of religion are doing, but I think it's a fair point. But the positive spin is that that's an opportunity for philosophers of religion to look ever more carefully at the non-philosophy of religion literature on freedom and to find the insights and apply them as needed and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. The next question is going to Danny. Danny, why don't you go ahead?
Allow me to turn my camera on. Okay. Can I be heard?
Yep.
Yes. So I'm going to ask my question, and then I want to follow that up with why I wanted to ask it, or some motivations for my concern. So the question is something like, or for those that think that God thinks discursively, so maybe it makes inferences and stuff like that, when God makes epistemic conclusions, would he be responsible for those conclusions, or free to have made those conclusions? And I guess what motivates me to ask this question is that often discourse around free will is almost inextricably tied to practical or moral responsibility. There's not a lot of talk about epistemic responsibility. And I think one of the issues about moral or practical responsibilities, the boundaries of what is counted as immoral or impractical, are much broader and usually not as clear. Whereas with epistemic responsibility, they might be it may not only clear, but maybe there's only one sort of decision-making process that gets you to the right conclusion. And so that brings, whether this sort of question or concern might be a concern for those that think that a requirement of freedom or responsibilities to have the ability to do differently. Because what I'm thinking is that, suppose there's one sort of decision-making process where or there's only one way to make the decision in a way where you're not irrational. Well, if you could have done otherwise, then the pain will be that you're irrational if you did otherwise, or if you chose otherwise, or made a different another conclusion epistemically, I suppose. So I was wondering what y'all thought about that.
Oh, Klaus?
Yeah, I don't have much to say. I mean, okay, so God's reasoning discursively, so God thinks if A, then B. And by the way, A. Is it really the case that B, it's a bit hard to imagine God hesitating for a fraction of a second about whether B in a case like that, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that it's more common, I suppose, to think of perfect rationality as, infallibly drawing the most rational conclusion, or never making mistakes about validity or whatever, right? So I suppose you're right. There's maybe a disanalogy there with the freedom side of things, right? But I don't know. Is there I don't know of any philosophy of religion literature on this, but maybe others do.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know there's a lot of stuff on epistemic blame and praise, though, that could probably be filtered into a philosophy of religion context for sure, and responsibility. But yeah, no, that makes sense. For a final question, actually, maybe we have time for two more. There's like a question that I think that I might want to ask. So in line with sort of what Steve and I are developing, so we have significant responsibility and significant responsibility. The final option that I think that is available for the theist is, well, God just has like no responsibility whatsoever. Okay, so what? Okay, Perry Hendricks was the person who initially presented this objection to us, and it's vexed Steve and I interminably. And I'm wondering what you think about it. I mean, so it seems as though the position could be something as follows. God doesn't need to be responsible because we don't need to worship him in the way that, let's say, we would worship a moral being. That moral import is unjustified. We can appreciate him in this way that we might appreciate a sunset. So we're in awe of him, and that's really enough. Isn't that enough for you, Nathan and Steve? And let's just pack our bags and go home. Really, all you've done is shown us that responsibility is not a divine attribute, and you've helped clarify our concept of God rather than refuting that such a God exists. So what? And I was wondering what you might think of that for the theist who's just going to dump divine freedom altogether, because it's just too thorny of an issue. The problems are insurmountable, and after all, we could worship God like we appreciate a sunset. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
So it's widely taken for granted that God has a will and that God's will is free. And you're right, this is generally thought to connect to moral responsibility and praiseworthiness. Linda Zagzebski, as I understand it, is someone who thinks that God doesn't have a will at all, and so therefore doesn't have free will. Lefto criticizes her on that. So that's one example of a theist who thinks that God doesn't have free will. I don't know if she addresses praiseworthiness. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know that I have much to say really about the thought. Um, it seems like an instance. Well, maybe this is putting things too negative. But it seems like an instance where when you get into, if it's the case that defenders of a traditional conception of divine freedom get into trouble in various scenarios with this, then of course one obvious move is to revise your concept of God to make the problem go away. So this seems like an instance of that kind of move. But I'm curious to hear what others think.
Yeah, for sure. I know that Steve and I have thought a lot about it, so I would defer to him. But no, that's fair. I guess a follow-up question that I would ask is this. I mean, if you think that we remove divine freedom, let's say that we take it away, do you think that worship goes down with it?
I'm inclined to say yes, but I don't have a worked out theory of worship in my back pocket. And I'm inclined to say you're right that one could appreciate. We don't think the sun is morally responsible, but we still appreciate sunsets. So appreciation, yes. Maybe we don't worship the sun though. So yeah, I'm inclined to think yes, but I haven't thought a great deal about it.
Okay, perfect. If there are any lingering questions, we have about 4 minutes. So yeah, John Martin Fisher, go ahead.
So I was wondering, a suggestion for Nathan's worry about insignificant freedom. There's this view that God can have high knowledge and low knowledge. And, low knowledge would be stuff like trivial stuff, or even he knows when I sneeze or go to the bathroom or whatever it is. But that somehow the low knowledge is compatible with his perfect being. And you'd say something like that about freedom. He has high freedom, low freedom. And what I was thinking is, it's kind of like, the problem is the low freedom comes from the high freedom, or is in some way necessary. It piggybacks on the high freedom. Like, if God has significant knowledge, then presumably it follows that he has knowledge of these other trivial things. So anyway, I think maybe you could make that kind of analogy. And finally, this is a bit of a stretch, but it's like a spandrel, like an evolutionary spandrel is something that piggybacks on something else that is an evolutionary advantage. So maybe there are metaphysical spandrels or logical spandrels. So the low knowledge is a logical spandrel of the high knowledge. The same deal with freedom.
Really interesting suggestion.
Yeah, that's a super interesting suggestion. I'll have to think about that. What do you think insignificant responsibility would be a spandrel of? I mean, would it be a spandrel of like essential moral perfection?
Well, it'd be like a spandrel that piggybacks on substantial moral responsibility.
Substantial, yeah. Okay.
Because if you base responsibility in terms of acting freely, that would seem to entail that you'd have the freedom to do insignificant things as well. Although this is just off the top of my head.
Well, what's off the top of John Martin Fisher's head is normally brilliant. So I mean, I'll have to certainly think about that quite deeply and quite thoroughly, because I think that's a fantastic suggestion. That might be worth writing up, actually. Okay, very good, very good. Yeah, no, that's awesome. All right, well, we're just closing in on time, and I'm very particular about being punctual. So yeah, I just want to thank Klaas for coming and for writing a fantastic SEP entry. I think that all of us learned quite a bit, not only about the literature, but about the metaphysics that he's describing, and we all are better off that he's written it. So I just want to thank Klaas for joining us, thank him for presenting the article, and for answering our questions. It's been a fantastic hour and a half, and yeah, I wish we could do this again sometime, but yeah, this was amazing.
Thanks to you, Nathan, and for organizing, and to all of you. I'm going to be compelled to revise this entry every n number of years, and I am certain that your excellent suggestions will prompt some careful revisions.
Oh,
You'll be
perfect.
compelled, but you'll be acting freely.
Okay. Wonderful. All right. Fabulous. Well, see you guys. Thank you. I'll send a follow-up email. I'm just thanking everyone, but yeah, thank you very much. All right. See you all.
Thank you for arranging.